Good morning, everybody. On behalf of DocEng community, I'm very happy to introduce the second keynote presentation of this conference. I'm very happy to introduce Mark Davis and Luke Swartz, who will speak about internationalization problems at Google. So Mark is a very well-known person who was one of the conceptor of Unicode. So he has a very deep understanding of these problems, and we are very proud to see you here today. And Luke has done his study at Stanford, and now he's working also in Google at Google for these problems. I would say that we are very interested in your presentation, and working at Unicode give you a lot of competence, and specifically for your work also in how to represent languages in documents, in XML documents and HTML documents. And you have worked on so many companies, from Apple to IBM and now Google, so you are the right person. So let us hear you.
All right, thanks very much, Cecilia. It's also an honor to work with Mark. I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to Google Plus Internationalization. So Google Plus is a new product that we came out with a couple months ago, and it had a lot of, not all of them unique, but many of them interesting internationalization problems, many of which were solved, some of which are still ahead of us. So first, what exactly is it? It's basically a social network, but it's also a platform designed to make it easier to share things with other people and establish your online identity. So it has certain key features, the main one being circles, that you can control what you share people with. So you control what you share with whom. There's a feature called Hangouts, which is basically a multi-user chat and video conference feature where you can have up to 10 people doing video chat with each other and look at YouTube videos together. And as of yesterday, there's broadcasting, there's Google Docs sharing, that sort of thing. Actually, I'm just going to skip this and go straight to the demo because it's better to just see how some of this stuff works. So basically, it's the main interface is sort of a stream where you can see right now Brad Horowitz is talking with a bunch of people online right now. A bunch of people have shared a bunch of things either directly to me or just with the public, and I'm following them. So it allows both intimate sharing model as well as sort of a Twitter-like broadcast model, all in one product. So, and the way it does that is using circles. So I could say maybe create a circle right now that I can call DocEng. So I can sort of lump together people that I meet here. So I'm going to scroll this up to the top just so it's easier to see. All right. Yeah, all right. So, so for example, I know that Mark is here, so I can add him. And then let's say that I'm looking for more people. Well, as of just yesterday, we launched a feature where you can search not only all the people, but all the posts. So I can notice that, oh, Kevin Marks is here. And I can add him to that new circle that I just created called DocEng. So now I can follow whatever Kevin Marks decides to either share with me, or in this particular case, it's a public post, sort of like a tweet. So how does internationalization fit in? Well, this is the first Google product, we're proud to say, from the first day of its launch, supported 44 different languages. So I can very easily, I'm just going to use the debugging flag here. So now, right now, all my interface, obviously Kevin's post is still in English, but the rest of my interface is all in French here. It also works in right-to-left languages as well. This we're particularly proud of, with a full RTL layout where it's properly mirrored. There's a few minor bugs that we're still working out, but mostly it works pretty well, including if I start typing in a left-to-right language, it'll automatically shift over the context of the share box. So that's just a brief introduction so you have an idea what we're talking about. So it has a lot of the same problems as other social networks do and other web apps. So what are some of the, what we call sort of bloopers, things that we had problems with, especially early on? So this is a page, this is the very first dialog box the user ever sees when they first sign up, when the interface is set to Japanese. So does anyone notice a problem? About 90% of the text is in English, right? So this string, as it turned out, was untranslated because it was basically hard-coded in the, well, it wasn't actually hard-coded, but it wasn't properly extracted, basically, into our translation database for translation. And it wasn't discovered until right before the launch. So sort of the lesson learned is, and the reason why it wasn't discovered is because you would only see this screen if you're first signing up. Well, all the Googlers that were testing this had already signed up, so they weren't testing this new dialog box that just got added. So sort of the lesson learned is to make sure you check not just corner cases, but you check things like sign-up flows, things that users would only go through once in various languages. There were also a few other related things with RTL languages that needed checking that were early on in the sign-up flow. So this is another thing that was on our initial marketing page. Does anyone speak Turkish here? Right, do you notice any problems? Yeah, the characters aren't right, and it's actually a Unicode encoding problem, which was particularly embarrassing for us because Mark is like the world expert on Unicode. Well, it turns out it wasn't Google technology. It was someone used some image editing software. I don't know if it was Photoshop or Illustrator or something that didn't properly handle Unicode correctly. And so when they created these marketing photos, the text got garbled. So this was a screenshot from Twitter. A blogger actually caught it before we did. So the lesson learned here is particularly when you're dealing with images to sort of double check, because a lot of the image editing programs out there don't properly encode things as well as, say, the Google suite does. In general, the Google Docs do a pretty good job with Unicode. But whatever, I'm not sure which image processing software we use for this, but it had garbled it. All right, another problem we had with RTL languages, this is probably a lesson that Yahoo learned many years ago that we had to relearn. If your brand starts or ends in punctuation, like +1 or Google+, it has particular pitfalls for right-to-left languages. So since the plus is interpreted as punctuation, which would come after the LTR Google, when we type in Google+, it shows up as plus Google. This is the Hebrew layout, but it was similar in Arabic and Persian. So we had to do various things to try and fix it. One of the things we tried and failed to do was add a left-right marker, which it turned out one of our template engines just escaped as LRM. So for a day we were showing an escape character, which made it even worse. So there's particular pitfalls for punctuation at the beginning or end. This was from about a week after launch. Anyone here speak Chinese? This is tradition. Did you notice anything about this? This is the gender selector. Yeah, it says, choose your gender, female or other. Yeah. So a lot of people were like, well, which, I don't get, so. And what had happened, it was a minor glitch in our translation database where the translation for traditional Chinese for male was accidentally deleted. And the lesson learned here is having a good system for user feedback. We have something we call Google Feedback that's integrated. It's baked into a lot of Google products, but especially Google+, that makes it really easy for users to report bugs. And we very quickly, as soon as this error happened, I'd say within hours, we had almost 100 feedback messages with people saying, what am I, other? Thus we were able to quickly change it in a few hours, basically. It was a little bit embarrassing, but it could have been much more embarrassing if it had gone on catch. So this is another thing that was embarrassing at first. This is my friend Erica. And you notice that we clearly know that she's female, but it says Erica has not filled out their profile yet. So we had a number of users, including on that feedback engine. My favorite feedback began with, I'm sorry, but I'm an English teacher. And it went on from there, complaining about their, referring to Erica. So one is that it's somewhat unstandard in English to use their in the singular, but in particular, if you know someone's gender, you ought to use the appropriate pronoun, which in English would be, Erica's not filled out her profile yet. So that's now been fixed, and Mark will get into a little bit of how we fixed that, because there's some interesting APIs that we developed to help fix that. There's more complicated problems involving numbers as well. So this is one problem that we solved where we said, okay, Vic and Dotra hung out with 10 people, and then this is my friend Josh, who's very lonely. He just hung out with himself. So you see that it's 10 people, but one person. So it's properly inflected for English. But it turns out that many other languages are not as simple as English, where you can either say equals 1, then it would be person. And if it's anything other than 1, then it's people. For example, in Russian, the translation for Vic and Dotra hung out with 10 people is this messy 10, it's basically pusin. Like we have to kind of abbreviate it because the ending in Russian depends on what the number is before. There's several different endings that you can have. And again, Mark will get into how we solve that particular problem. There's a similar problem in other languages like French, where adjectives can inflect based on the gender. So here, again, it's clear that we know that Vic and Dotra is a male, or he's revealed that online. However, it looks like he has a gender identity problem here, where we're not sure if he's male and married or female and married. Right? So a similar kind of problem there. So now I'm going to pass it off to Mark, who's going to talk about some of the core technologies, in particular how we solve that gender and plural problem.
Thanks, Luke. And one thing I want to point out is Luke joined us just around January or so, but has been instrumental in pulling all of these things together. He's the PM for the Google Internationalization, Google Plus Internationalization. So he's done a great job. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of the technical foundation behind this, and then Luke's going to come on a little bit more and talk about another piece of it. So in terms of internationalization, we use kind of the same foundation that we use in other Google products. So we're using Unicode every place for all of the text data that we have. We are using core internationalization libraries depending upon for dates, times, numbers, sorting, etc. And this depends upon some common open source projects like CLDR, which is the Unicode locale data repository, and ICU, which is a very prominent internationalization library. And we're using our localization process, which involves translation memory and management and translators feeding in and out. And Luke will talk a little bit more about that. This is pretty standard for Google, so we didn't have to do a lot here. And most of the Google engineers are very, sort of brought into the process of making sure that we cover all of these languages, because our standard policy is to have at least 40 languages for products. So what I'm going to talk about are some of the things that were a little bit different that we did for Google+. And so these include plurals and genders. You just saw about that. The universal language settings, which Luke is going to talk about in more detail. Name checking, the alphabetic index, the integrated translate, pseudo localization, and continuous localization. So let's talk a little bit about a fairly easy one, index letters. What we do is, and I think we don't have a demo here, but if you go, there's a link we can show you which shows the use of this in Google+. It turns out it's not trivial to figure out exactly which letters a language uses in an index. And an index is something where you put up a bunch of letters to the top, you click on one, and you jump to a bucket. And these vary across languages. You see some things like the CH in Slovak sorts as if it's a letter, and items will be grouped under it rather than under C. For Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, those present their own particular problems. There are a couple of different major orders for Chinese, and you don't actually show the characters that go into a first character that goes into that bucket as the name of the bucket for Chinese. And then with Japanese, even though you have a kanji character, you actually will bucket it under the corresponding kana character. So these all present some difficulties that we had to work through. Name checking turns out to be interesting. And one of the, if you have followed Google Plus at all, you know that there's been a certain amount of controversy about the Google name policy. we're not talking particularly about the policy, but about some of the features to separate out some of the chaff in people's names. And those include trying to make sure that we are using common names that people use, and that we're excluding kind of overly fanciful characters. You see some ones over on this side of the screen. There's Mark with a Cyrillic A. We wanted to make sure that people weren't mixing scripts that could be used in spoofing. There are decorated characters in Unicode, like ones with circles around them and so on. There are very fanciful characters, which are symbols. In this case, I think this is like that M is really an alchemical symbol, and then the upside down A is a math symbol, and then you get the R for prescription, and then the K is some other special symbol. So we see these a lot. We also see people with sort of spurious spellings, lots of characters in a row, or that they use combining marks in a way that actually combining marks in a good display will stack upwards kind of indefinitely. And we've seen cases where people will stack like 50 combining marks, and you get weird UI interactions because this name actually goes up and down like that. So some of the techniques that we used are listed here. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but the main goal is to kind of separate out some of these more fanciful uses of characters. Now the plural problem. Luke gave a little bit of an example of some of the kinds of problems we see. You have emails. Everybody has seen something like this. The problem is where a placeholder changes another part of the sentence. And so the old workaround for this is to kind of present it like a form style, like you'd see if you were filling out a form when you're taking an airplane and coming in. You have a little form that says number of emails, and you've got a box. And people are used to kind of that formulation and avoiding the plural issue in that case. But it's very clunky and ugly, and especially in a social context, we wanted to have much, much more natural language. So what we really want is to fix this. And the other problem is Alice added 3-person to his circles. We also need to change placeholders in response to gender. So we added an API that handles a certain important class of these things. So it handles the gender, so that you can have parallel translation of messages for gender and plural. It handles the complex plural rules, and I'll talk very briefly about that. And it handles personal gender rules. Now, what it doesn't do is handle gender of objects. So in German, for example, a girl is neuter and a gas station is feminine. Okay, don't ask me why, but that's the way it works. And these kinds of things we don't handle. It turns out to be very difficult because you have to look up words, determine what the grammatical category is. The category can change wildly according to languages, because languages organize the world in different ways. And then you would need to inflect the thing according to where it is in the sentence and how it's being used, and the rules for inflections in the categories are exceedingly complex. So we don't do all of that. So here's an example from Serbian, for example. Maja je pozvala Uroša, and then Uroš je pozvao Maju. So Maja and Uroša are both changing depending upon which one I'm using where. And these are just the personal names. So we're not handling that as part of this package. I said that the plural rules are complicated. Here's an example from English and Ukrainian. English, most people in this room will understand and know the rules for. It's fairly simple. It turns out English ordinals are some of the more complicated ones, but for normal plurals, it's very simple. Ukrainian gets more complicated because it behaves kind of like English ordinals. I say first, second, third, and then I get up to 11th. So I skip 11 for the ST form, but then I go to 21. The Slavic languages work very much like this. So I use a plural form that goes with 1, skips 11, goes to 21, 31, 41, etc. And then I have another plural form in a lot of these for the to case, and another plural form for a few case, and then another plural form for the rest of them. So this gets complicated. Arabic is our worst one. Arabic, we have 6 different forms of the plurals. Here's a chart from the Unicode site which shows the different forms, and you're not expected to read this. There's not a test. But it just gives you an impression of how many ways in which languages can do different kinds of plurals, and it's complicated. So what the translator actually sees, the developer will put in something simple like he will put in the 0 case, the 1 case, and a plural case. We always use the 0 case, even though in many languages it's not separated formally according to the grammar, but often you still want to rephrase it. So you want to say you have one friend or you have no friends, which is kind of sad, but you want to phrase it in a different way. So you have the equivalent of you have no friends or you have no circles. So in Serbian, what the Serbian translator sees is we take the English messages and we fold them out into all of the cases for Serbian, and then the Serbian speaker will translate each of those messages. Same for Arabic, Russian, and so on. Genders. We have 3 genders, and that's not just because we're in the Bay Area. We have 3 genders because there's always an other case where we don't know your gender, you decided you declined to fill it in, or you didn't want it exposed for privacy purposes, or it's a person that we don't have in the system. We don't have your profile, we have an email from you, but we don't have any other information. So other is used for all of those cases. Now, what turned out to be kind of an interesting problem was to get the developers to recognize when they needed to use gender. And it's fairly clear if I'm saying John did X, okay, that we need gender. Fairly clear. Check out her profile. So if you see pronouns like his, her, their, oftentimes there is used to avoid a gender in English, as we saw earlier. It turns out the users, anytime you mention the user, then you need to put it in. But there are a lot of cases where it's indirect. So if I say welcome, welcome to Google+. If you are male, then I'm going to use a different word in Italian than if you're female. So these are cases, these indirect cases are actually kind of the trickiest, and they involve a lot of education of the developers to say, look, even though this doesn't require gender in English, it does require gender in some of the languages we use, so go ahead and use this API in order to deal with this. And then, as Luke talked about, we also have the problem with adjectives and so forth. So any terms like you are a participant, in French you'll get an E or not, depending upon whether it's feminine, and so forth. So we ended up having to support this in C++, Java, JavaScript, GWT, and enclosure templates, and then it's also supported as part of the open source ICU effort. And it's used throughout Google. This is from search. We do not have all of the locations and all of the products having gender and plural. We're slowly identifying them and prioritizing them so that people can introduce this into their APIs, into their user interfaces. So we're now going to talk about universal language settings. I'm going to turn it back over to Luke.
All right. Thank you, Mark. This is a project that we'd been working on a little bit before Google+, but Google+ is where we finally implemented it. Google, as you know, has a lot of different products, a lot of different web apps, and over the years, unfortunately, there's been different language settings for different products. So just to take, for example, the ones that we give to enterprise, if you sign up for Google Enterprise applications and you're an English speaker in Switzerland, say, like many of our colleagues that work in the Zurich office, then you find that you have to set your language preferences for Gmail, and then Calendar, and then Docs, and then Groups. Each one of these has a separate language preference. So we knew that that was frustrating for many of our users. It was also the case that each of them only let you select one language, whereas in some cases, maybe Gmail works in, say, an Indic language, but maybe Docs does not. So how do you, so if we were to unify them, how would we set it up so that you could get Gmail in your preferred language, but then Docs, maybe you would default to English or some other second choice language. The other thing is that each of these products also has somewhat inconsistent ways in which they resolve the language. And by that we mean figure out which UI language to present the user. So our solution that we came out with in Google Plus and we're slowly integrating into other products is to allow a ranked language preference list. So as you can see here, this particular user has US English as their first choice language, and then Italian, and then French. So what's the advantage to this? So one is that if your first choice language is a relatively small language that's not supported in all products, then we can show you that language in those products that do support it, and then if not, then we'll default to your second or third choice. The other thing this allows us to do is to be smart about what content we show the user. So we might, for example, for this particular user, we might not automatically translate Italian and French websites, right? Because if they already speak Italian and French, then they probably don't want to keep having to dismiss, do you want this translated? Or no, I speak those. Or maybe when we show them certain search results, we would rank those search results in these languages higher because we know the user speaks those languages. So what signals do we use? So we have what we call the HL parameters, mostly an internal tool used for testing, but it sort of is an override. There's the explicit user preferences that we mentioned before that are stored in the cloud. There's the browser's accept language that comes across in the HTTP header, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's the browser's UI language. There's whatever the primary language is for the given domain, and then finally there's geolocation of the user's IP address. So one sort of controversial thing, which this is a meme that somebody made internally, is that Google does not honor the accept language header if it's only English. So in other words, if you have anything other than English, or you have English and something else, then it's in accordance with this list here. But we skip over the accept language if it's just English. And to explain why that is, it's basically sort of a utilitarian philosophy, is that we did some number crunching and found that although there's many English-speaking users that find that frustrating because they say, damn it, I've set my accept languages to English, you should respect that. That there's a large number of users around the world who have their accept language set to English, but who clearly do not speak English. Like there's, I think, a huge population, especially in Southeast Asia, that for whatever reason have their browsers incorrectly set. So, and particularly because a lot of these users are sort of emerging markets users, they're using these web cafes and stuff like that where they don't have full control. It would be particularly painful if we were to switch all those users to English, whereas it's sort of a minor inconvenience for the English-speaking traveler who's usually the one that gets affected. That being said, we recognize that this is a pain point, and part of the universal language settings is at least making sure that anyone that's logged in should have their cloud-based settings respected, which we don't currently do a good job of. So that's one of the innovations we did with Google+. Another one had to do with our localization process. So this is, again, like the earlier slide Mark showed you, this is not an eye test. You're not expected to actually read this, but this is one person's representation of what our process used to be, with 17 separate steps where different people would forward things on. In some cases, it was, people with Harvard degrees whose whole job it was to, move things from one folder to another all day. It was very manual and sort of clunky. Whereas we've changed it to be what we call continuous localization, which is as a developer checks in a string into our database, it's automatically updated to a tool called Google Translator Toolkit, which is actually available externally as well, which syncs up with Google Translate, so it's machine-aided translation. as those strings get checked in, they automatically get sent to translators around the world, who then translate them, and then those get re-inputted into the product on a daily basis. So we're able to very quickly turn around translations, often within as little as a day or two, in a process that used to take several weeks maybe. So that's part of how we were able to launch it in 44 languages and do so from day one, because of that much quicker process. Another thing that helped is pseudo localization, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is where we take an original English string and we make some transformations to it to make it look like another language. So the one on the right, for example, is adding a bunch of diacritics so that we can verify that whatever code is involved handles Unicode properly. And then it also expands the string, because those of you that know that the OK is 2 characters in English, but maybe in German it's 17 characters. So by expanding it, we can make sure that the UI can handle longer strings for certain languages. And then on the left, we have what we call fake BiDi. So this is a simulation of a right-to-left language where so it's basically English just spelled out backwards. So that way we can check all of our right-to-left layouts, and it's easy for an English-speaking developer to see where there's errors. You don't have to speak Arabic or Hebrew or something in order to test your layouts with that. So it takes a little getting used to read it, but most English speakers can kind of figure it out well enough to be able to catch bugs. So these are both invaluable tools for debugging and troubleshooting. And now we'll bring Mark back up and we'll do some Q&A.
Oops. I keep stumbling over that. So, does anyone have any questions? No questions at all. Okay.
You mentioned that you have this whole library for doing translations and everything, but it wasn't clear for me. Was it an effort to educate developers, or do you actually have a better system of storing strings so that you can translate them automatically?
Okay. Yeah. Let me flesh out a little bit of what happens. So the developer produces a file that contains some strings. We actually support a wide variety of different formats for those strings to be in. They can be extracted directly from templating systems. They can be in separate XML files. They can be in separate Java property files, and so forth. The extraction process takes wherever those are checked in, extracts them into a common XML format, and then the XML format goes through the entire process that you saw Luke give. And it will go in and then come out the other end. We get some more XML that is in the particular languages that we're dealing with. Then those get unextracted back into source that corresponds to whatever the developer originally had. So you might get another Java property file. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
I have one question too. You said that your API for gender management has been quite recently done, in fact, and now is used by different products of Google. How has it been done? Because has it been difficult to insert such new functions inside existing products, or was it?
Was it easy? It was not. Luke is smiling. No, it was not trivial. We went through quite a number of iterations. The API was actually fairly straightforward to introduce, and so the API for plurals and gender, we made some additions to it, but part of the problem was getting it adapted into each of the languages, and especially when you're adapting it into a templating language, then you have a lot more work to do, because a templating language has its own syntax, and so you have to try to figure out how it all matches. What were some of the other issues? Some of the other issues were really educating the translators on how to deal with this new format and what to do and how to handle the different forms and what they meant. Making sure that the entire machinery from start to end didn't hiccup. So this is a new kind of special syntax, and we needed to make sure that when it went into the translation process, it didn't cause hiccups that were reflected back to the user, which stopped the build. Because if I check in some source code and there's a problem with the translation, that can stop the extraction for all of the text in that file. And so we had to make some changes that allowed it to only block certain messages where people had syntax problems or something like that. We also had people by convention. Every message has a description, and the description is what really allows the translator to make sense of the message. If I have a one-word message in English like file, then the translator has no idea, does this a file like a physical thing that I'm filing something? Is it something I put papers into? Is it a verb? Is it a noun? So you have to have a message that makes sense and spells out what the translator has to do. But then we also add an extra marker in that description that tells us, oh, and this message is supposed to be plural, so we better see the plural syntax in it. And then we also look at the syntax and see, well, this has the plural syntax in it, we better see the marker in it, just as a double check to make sure that people don't make mistakes. So it actually was quite a long and involved process. Yeah, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess the other piece that Mark alluded to a bit in the talk is just educating developers on when and where to use it. So there's the cases where English inflects are more obvious, where it's, Cindy has added you to her circle versus his circle. That's fairly straightforward. It's harder in the cases like the married case there, where you have to show them, hey, in other languages it makes a difference whether the user is male or female. Although that being said, there are a few Google products where people started using it before we even announced it. So some people are very enthusiastic about it. So it's somewhat idiosyncratic which developers and which products either took more convincing and more education, or there's some that just jumped right on it. In many cases, it's Googlers that are that speak many of the languages that get affected, who have been suffering through bad translations all along, who are really happy that finally we're fixing it. So especially the Russian speakers were just overjoyed that this very clunky translations are now looking much better.
Yeah, we checked in the code. We'd made no announcements, nothing, and we turned around in a couple of days and we found that 3 or 4 products were already using it, even though somehow they discovered it. It was very curious. Yeah.
Do you have any cases of localization or internationalization where just working on the text is not enough? You've actually got to work on the structural layout of the displays and that sort of thing, where you can't just leave it into just the textual part?
I'd say BiDi is probably the...
Well, yeah, in a way you can deal with the whole thing is kind of a globalization process, and we like a lot of people break it up into the internationalization part and the localization part. And the internationalization part is making sure that the core code handles all of the languages, all of the characters that you call services in order to do things like format a date, instead of throw the month, year, and day together with some punctuation and hope that it works. So part of that is the internationalization, and then the localization is making sure that all the strings work. There are definitely, in the localization side, there are definitely constraints by the way that we work. English is always our source, so whatever can be expressed in English, we have to make sure that the message descriptions are clear enough, even though the English may be ambiguous. We also end up having to make sure that the developer properly uses different messages where they could have a different translation in different language. Okay, I took the file example and I could have two instances of file, and that doesn't actually occur, but a bunch of cases do occur, where the developer uses the same message in two different contexts, and they need to have radically different translations. And if the developer uses the same message, the translator's stuck. And so we have to go in and help them to understand how to kind of disentangle this stuff so that it can be handled properly. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
I mean, it's going more beyond just the text to something that's much more intensive. Let's take an example. That in a particular locale culture, you shouldn't put one section next to another. It implies something that's socially unacceptable.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a few simple examples where it's more than the text. So one is this example here with the pseudo localization, is that one of the internationalization problems is that this button here that says start a hangout should expand or contract to as necessary with the string. So there's many cases in which developers who just use English and who don't test using tools like this might just assume that a button will always be the exact same number of pixels. But then as soon as you test it with other languages or pseudo-localized languages, then you realize, oh, I see, this has to be dynamic. So that's a simple layout thing. When you're dealing with right-to-left languages, it's much more complicated because everything has to be mirrored. But I think you're getting a little bit more subtle even, where you're saying that in some languages or cultures there might be sort of bad associations or things that are more than just text. So some of that has to do with the way we localize things like icons. So it's an old example, but one we give in our talks often is on Orkut, they used to have an ice cube that meant cool, which is funny in English, but like that joke doesn't really translate very well. So they had to come up with similar icons that meant cool, or the equivalent of cool in other languages. Or similar things like in Google+, we had some problems where searching for something with the traditional Chinese interface, looking for Taiwanese stars, sometimes like mainland stars would show up, and it was sort of like getting that search algorithm working properly, where if someone was searching in traditional Chinese, most of the search results would be in traditional Chinese. Those sort of things. It's a little bit more than just straight translation, and it has to do with the cultural significance.
Yeah, I will say that we do run into these and have to adjust them. In some cases, people have a little bit of the wrong impression. Like, a lot of people will bring up, well, white is the color of mourning in mourning for death in some East Asian countries, so that you should avoid it. It turns out that's not really true. I mean, it may be the color of mourning, but they use white paper and they have white screens and so on. And black is the color of mourning here, but we use black for text and so on. So there are many cases where it's sometimes overblown. I'm not saying you're doing it, but we do have to pay special attention to icons. In some cases, there are certain features that will be enabled or disabled depending upon the language. One thing that I don't think Luke talked about was one of the issues we have to do is whenever you're introducing a new string, it actually has to be under flags so that we don't show it until we actually have the translations ready. So that's part of what we do, because we are running, people are getting new features all the time. You want to make sure that you don't see the new feature until the translation is ready in your language. Yeah.
So it seems like one of the goals of your effort is it has to do with being able to manage costs of internationalizing. You have a common core that you can use, and so I'm curious. The thing I'm curious about is, it makes sense to me that Google might choose not to support some language because it only has 200 speakers in the world, right? Something like that, or only 1 million instead of 20 million. But have you reached a point where technical issues about the internationalization are essentially not a relevant cost factor? Have you gotten to a point where you don't have to worry about, like, do we not handle any right to left languages at all because it's too expensive to make that shift? Or are you still are technical issues about supporting a new language still do they still hit you once in a while?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'd say just at the very beginning, you talked about the cost management, but part of the reason why we and so many other companies have adopted this sort of internationalization versus localization model is that we can have much, much more robust software. There's this old model where you produce the software here and then throw the source code over to some lab in Japan and say, okay, make it work in Japanese. And we don't do that. Any big modern company doesn't do that because it's incredibly error prone. You end up with different SKUs, different bugs. The whole process is a nightmare both for us and for customers. So part of it's not cost, it's quality. As far as the impediments, definitely BiDi is a big issue. When we first introduced a 40 language initiative in Google about 3 years ago, I think, something like that. And we said all the major products have to handle 40 languages. And you saw a huge amount of effort, people really coordinated around getting this done, and you saw a whole bunch of products go right up to 38. And then they hit this wall because for a UI, Arabic and Hebrew represent some significant obstacles. Now, but once you handle those, and you can handle those basically with the same internationalization techniques, and we have services that you can call to wrap the text in a way that works for all of the RTL languages. So I think the only major language issue that can cause an impediment would be like Mongolian, which is only written vertically. And that would be a big issue for us to take on because that would require a huge amount of work. Other language issues, when you talk about search, for example, some of the big issues are how do you segment? So we need to put into place processes for dividing up text into words so that you can uniformly search them, and we haven't done that for a couple of languages, for I think Khmer and Myanmar, Burmese. But it's a matter of putting together the resources to do that. I mean, it's fairly significant amount of resources to do that segmentation. And then synonyms are a big issue. How to determine whether two terms, which could be just inflected forms of the same word, really represent the same thing. And that's actually, those are very tricky research-ish problems. We've had a lot of success with Google Translate, which takes kind of brute force approach to translation. And for that, the main impediment is having lots and lots of bilingual documents. I mean, facing pages. So if you look at Google Translate, I think we have about 65 languages, and it's basically limited by the number of instances of good bilingual text. If there's a large corpus of good bilingual text, then we can translate from Myanmar to Tamil. And if there isn't, then we can't.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Actually, your last comment relates back to something I was going to ask you about earlier. For your particular work, am I right in thinking you really don't take any knowledge of grammar into account at all? I mean, one way to tackle the question about gender of nouns would be just to say, well, it's a huge problem over all languages, but it is finite, and I don't know why it's la table, but it is la table, but it's der Tisch or whatever in German. But on the other hand, you could say, well, you know, your example about girl, was it? Das Mädchen? The reason it's neuter is because it's a diminutive. You see, maid, Mädchen. Do you feel that the rules don't buy you an awful lot because there's too many exceptions or it becomes too complicated? You seem to be saying that the whole Google Translate is very much a statistically driven thing, you know. Whenever I see that, it seems to generate that with probability 0.99, so that's what we'll do. Yeah?
Well, we're not part of the Translate team, so we can't really speak for them, and I'm sure they've talked about it in other venues. But basically, it uses the ability to analyze pieces of corresponding bilingual text in order to avoid the problem of coming up with and analyzing a language model. And people had been doing that for 30 years, and it turns out to be extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming and difficult and problematic. And it turns out that you get a huge amount of value. I mean, we could not support the range of languages that we have in Google Translate if every time we had to do a new language, we had to develop this incredibly complicated language model in order to support it. It would not scale.
Any more questions? So we can.
Okay, thank you.